Opening title appears. Universal Design in Higher Education. Title swipes across the screen, followed by Roger O. Smith, followed by Tim O'Connor, followed by UW La Crosse. Title fades to black. Universal Design and Testing, Part 1, Tim O'Connor. Video fades to black. Tim O'Connor standing behind a podium in front of an audience.
I've been at UW-Madison for 18 years, and part of the job that I do is I do the special accommodations due to disabilities for placement tests for pretty much every campus in the UW system. And it's what I've been busy doing now for the last few months, a lot of my time. My background is in learning disabilities. So a long time ago, I was a learning disabilities teacher. So learning is my background, and that's where a lot of my interests are. And so I've continued, through the 18 years I've been at UW-Madison, I've continued to work in the area of disabilities as much as I can. And as June mentioned, I do now chair the UW System President's Advisory Committee on Disability Issues, which Al and Roger both are members of as well. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about testing. Testing is a very important part of instruction, as we all know. That's how you assess student learning. That's how you figure out those ever-important grades that students need and desire so desperately. Well, there's a lot more to it than that. And it's important because universal design plays a very important role in that. So we're going to look at some of the areas where we can change little things and look at testing maybe in a little different light so that you can understand you can use universal design and make testing better. It'll be better for your students. There are ways to make them better learners from using better testing methods. So the first thing we'll talk about, most of the time I'm just going to spend here, is going to be talking about toward a better understanding of testing. And then after that, we're going to talk about something that the project, the Access Ed project, is creating, and those are test audits, which will help you assess your testing, both the physical environment as well as the testing event itself, which I think is very, very helpful. First, toward a better understanding of testing. Merriam-Webster defines testing as something, as a series of questions or exercises, for measuring the skill, knowledge, intelligence, capacities, or aptitudes of an individual or group. Tests are a tool to measure behavior, knowledge, or skills. Tests are not magic, voodoo, or witchcraft. If you look at the public perception of tests, I think that's probably a majority opinion of what tests do. They think there's something magic, and they are not. Okay, they are only a tool, and they're only as good as they are developed and only as good as they're meant to be used. So don't use them for things that they're not meant to be used for. A couple of terms that are very important, and you hear them all the time when you're talking about standardized testing, but they're every bit as important when you're talking about course tests as well, any kind of test. One of those is validity. Validity is the extent that a test measures what it is meant to measure. In other words, I give you a test, I want to measure your reading abilities. That's what that test is for, specifically to measure that. It's not meant as a general knowledge test. It's not meant to be used in other circumstances. It's that and that alone. Just like the tests you give in your courses are meant to measure what is taught in that course. That's all. It's not meant for anything else. People tend to give more to it, but the validity of a test is a very important measure. The other thing is reliability. This is one that's often overlooked. We think, well, my test is valid. It measures what I want it to measure, but is it reliable? Reliability means the extent to which a test is consistent and accurate in measuring what it is meant to measure. Oftentimes, this is an over time kind of a thing. You give your test at one time. Is it as reliable the next time you give it? One other term I want to talk about, and you hear it a lot, especially with students with disabilities, and that's reasonable accommodations. Now, I change it a little bit and I say accommodations, reasonable. That's a very important part of accommodations, is they must be reasonable. There is a difference between an accommodation and a modification, and it's an important difference. While both accommodations and modifications are non-standard conditions, accommodations differ in that modifications change what construct is being measured, whereas accommodations should only change how a construct is measured. A construct is what you measure. Reading test, the construct being measured is reading. So in other words, using it inappropriately would be a modification. Reading a reading test to a student, you want to measure their reading ability. If you read that test to them, thinking that's an accommodation, it's not. It's a modification. That's not the construct that you wanted to measure. Therefore, the test is really, in a sense, completely invalid. It has no construct validity. This is important to think about, and this includes your courses too. The idea of an accommodation versus a modification is a very important point. Most students benefit from extended time on tests, not just students with disabilities. That's important to remember, and it's something you should think about when you devise tests. A review of over 40 studies concluded that students without learning disabilities also benefit from extended time, although not as much. See, the idea of the extended time is to filter out a disability. All students feel better, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a minute, when they're given that extended time. The most significant effect may be psychological. One study suggests that extended time may affect psychological functioning more than performance on standardized tests. In essence, providing a more positive testing experience by reducing test anxiety and creating the opportunity to utilize good test-taking strategies. So it's kind of like, should I make time an important issue on my test? Think about that one. That's a very important universal design concept when you're creating a test. Why is time an issue? Is it only because that's the amount of time we have in a class? Maybe you should think about changing the way you test so that it doesn't become an issue. There's the security blanket effect, which goes hand in hand with this. Anecdotal records of students taking the University of Wisconsin placement test show that the majority of those receiving extended time accommodations use no more time to complete the test than those taking it under standardized conditions. And the number there is around 95%. Even though these students have disabilities, they don't need the time. Now, some of it is because it's not a time power test. But it's also because that security, they know they have that time, so they feel comfortable and they do a good job. They don't really need the time, but it's there if they do. This would be true of all students. Testing is part of the learning process. I'm going to talk about two methods of evaluation. You've probably heard the terms before. Summative evaluation. Summative evaluation is probably what most of you use to test the students in your courses. It assesses student learning. That's exactly what it does. You give it at points in time. Midterms, finals, 6 weeks exams, whatever they might be. It's a certain point in time where you're assessing the learning up to that point. Then there's a type of evaluation called formative evaluation. Formative evaluation is a process. It's an ongoing thing, a constant. I'm going to measure my students' learning all the time and change my teaching because of that. Research shows that formative evaluation improves student learning. So it not only assesses, it improves student learning. That's the major difference between them. Formative evaluation, that method, is a much more universally designed concept because it allows all students, no matter their abilities, and I'm not talking just students with disabilities here, it's all students, the ability to show what they really know. Don't think that your tests are necessarily perfect indicators of student learning, because they are probably not. And there are a number of reasons for that.
Video fades to black. Closing. R2D2 logo appears. Title reads, copy and distribute freely, but use in its entirety and do not alter. Access said project, copyright 2009, Rehabilitation, Research, Design, and Disability R2D2 Center. Please visit us at access-ed.r2d2.uwm.edu. The Access Ed project is supported in part by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education, PR Award P33A050090. The Access Ed documents contained in this video are those of the grantee and do not necessarily reflect directly on the U.S. Department of Education.